The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Well, good evening, and thank you all so much for coming out tonight. My name is Wayne Lesperance. I'm the Vice President of Academic Affairs here at the college and a professor of political science. This evening, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's program, and it is my honor to welcome back our two distinguished guests to the New England College campus. Some time ago, a friend to our college, Ambassador George Bruno, connected me with Mary Lee Smith of Renew America Together. We had a series of conversations, and what I found was somebody who shared a sense of concern that we weren't having the right conversations in our town hall meetings here in First in the Nation, New Hampshire, and that we weren't focused on how we could be moving our country forward together. And so in these conversations with Mary Lee and Ambassador Bruno, we were able to bring this program to you tonight. So I want to thank Mary Lee for all of her hard work on this, and Renew America Together for coming to New England College. Thank you so much for doing this. What I learned in those conversations was that Renew America Together was interested in adding NEC as a destination for one of its programs. As you know, our college was founded for veterans returning from World War II, and has had an ongoing commitment to civics and developing active and engaged citizens. That we are also located in First in the Nation, New Hampshire is also not lost on me. Good place to have this conversation. Renew America Together is a nonprofit organization designed to promote and achieve greater common ground in America by reducing partisan division and gridlock. Renew America's mission is to revitalize public and political discourse by teaching and promoting civics, citizenship, and civility. Something that we could use a heck of a lot more these days, in my view. NEC and Renew America seem to me to be a perfect match. So on behalf of President Perkins, on behalf of our Center for Civic Engagement, and on behalf of our civic community here at NEC, we welcome you all. I look forward to the discussion and hope you will all participate. And now allow me to introduce our guests. General Wesley Clark, retired, is a businessman, educator, writer, and commentator. General Clark served as chairman and CEO of Wesley K. Clark & Associates, a strategic consulting firm, chairman and founder of Envera Inc., a licensed investment bank, chairman of Energy Security Partners, LLC, as well as numerous corporate boards, including BNK Petroleum and Leagold Mining. He is active in energy, including oil and gas, biofuels, electric power and batteries, finance, and security. During his business career, he has served as an advisor, consultant, or board member of over 90 private and publicly traded companies. In the not-for-profit space, he is a senior fellow at UCLA's Burkle Center for International Relations, director of the Atlantic Council, founding chair of City Year Little Rock, North Little Rock, and president and founder of Renew America Together. A best-selling author, General Clark has written 4 books and is a frequent contributor on television and to newspapers. The general retired as a 4-star general after 38 years in the United States Army, having served in his last assignment as commander of U.S. Southern Command and then as commander of U.S. European Command, Supreme Allied Commander Europe. He graduated first in his class at West Point and completed degrees in philosophy, politics, and economics at Oxford University, both at the bachelor's and master's level, as a Rhodes Scholar. While serving in Vietnam, he commanded an infantry company in combat where he was severely wounded and evacuated home on a stretcher. He later commanded at the battalion, brigade, and division level and served in a number of significant staff positions, including service as the director, strategic plans, and policy. He was the principal author of both the U.S. National Military Strategy and Joint Vision 2010, prescribing U.S. warfighting for full spectrum dominance. He also worked with Ambassador Richard Holbrooke in the Dayton peace process, where he helped write and negotiate significant portions of the 1995 Dayton Peace Agreement. In his final assignment as Supreme Allied Commander Europe, he led NATO forces to victory in Operation Allied Force, the 78-day air campaign backed by ground invasion planning and a diplomatic process, saving 1.5 million Albanians from ethnic cleansing. His awards include the Presidential Medal of Freedom, Defense Distinguished Service Medal, 5 awards, Silver Star, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, honorary knighthoods from the British and Dutch governments, and numerous other awards from other governments, including Award of Commander of the Legion of Honor in France. He has also been awarded the Department of State Distinguished Service Award and numerous honorary doctorates and civilian honors. General Clark, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Andrew H. Card Jr. became chairman of the National Endowment for Democracy in January 2018, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the growth and strengthening of democratic institutions around the world. Card has also held numerous positions at senior levels of government under 3 presidents throughout the years, including Chief of Staff to President George W. Bush, where Card became the second longest tenured White House Chief of Staff. Card served as Deputy Chief of Staff to President George H.W. Bush, as well as U.S. Secretary of Transportation, and served President Ronald Reagan as Deputy Assistant to the President for Intergovernmental Affairs. Card served as President of Franklin Pierce University, our neighbor to the south, in New Hampshire here from January 2015 through July 2016. Prior to this, Secretary Card served as Executive Director of the Office of the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at Texas A&M University from August 2013 until December 2014. He served as Acting Dean of the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M from July 2011 until Dean Ryan Crocker's return from service as the U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan on August 1st, 2013. Secretary Card serves on the Board of Directors of Public Corporation Union Pacific, on the Board of Directors of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate, on the Business Advisory Board of Brainstorm Cell Therapeutics, and on the non-publicly traded boards for Energy Security Partners, Go Electric, and on a number of nonprofit boards. Card previously served on the advisory board of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He is also a professional speaker represented by the Washington Speakers Bureau and joined NBC News as a contributor in April 2017. While Chief of Staff to President George W. Bush, Card coordinated the priorities of the administration's agenda, the development of policies and appointments of cabinet secretaries and senior officials throughout the government. On September 11, 2001, Secretary Card is the one who whispered in President Bush's ear while the president was sitting in a classroom in Florida that terrorists had attacked the United States. Card then led a government-wide reorganization to best allocate resources to deal with the aftermath of 9/11 and the new terrorist environment. Prior to his tenure at as White House Chief of Staff, Card managed and ran the Republican National Convention in Philadelphia at the request of nominee Texas Governor George W. Bush. Before that, Secretary Card was Vice President, Government Relations for General Motors Corporation, one of the world's largest automobile manufacturers. In this role, Card directed the company's international, national, state, and local government affairs activities and represented GM on matters of public policy before the U.S. Congress and the administration. From 1993 to 1998, Card was President and Chief Executive Officer of the American Automobile Manufacturers Association, the trade association whose members were Chrysler Corporation, Ford Motor Company, and General Motors Corporation. When Chrysler became part of Daimler Corporation, Card oversaw the dissolution of the nearly 100-year-old trade association. In August 1992, at the request of President Bush, Secretary Card coordinated the administration's disaster relief efforts in the wake of the massive Hurricane Andrew. He also directed President Bush's transition office during the transition from the Bush administration to the Clinton administration. Prior to that, he served as Special Assistant and later as Deputy Assistant to the President and Director of Intergovernmental Affairs for President Ronald Reagan, where he was liaison to governors, statewide elected officials, state legislators, mayors, and other elected officials. From March 1987 until March 1988, Card ran the successful New Hampshire presidential primary campaign, first in the nation, for George H.W. Bush. Secretary Card, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Brian.
So the way this is going to work is we're going to invite General Clark and Secretary Card to each offer some introductory remarks. And then what we'll do is I will ask a few questions, and then I'm going to turn it over to you all in the audience to ask some questions as well. Sound good? All right. General Clark, could you start us off?
Well, first of all, Wayne, thanks for the introductions. And Andy, thank you so much for being with us. And this is a confession. We're on the board of Energy Security Partners together. So we know each other. We're in business together. But, you know, I'm a Democrat. I joined the party so I could run for president in 2003. And Andy Card is a Republican. And so the whole idea of this is to explore the differences between the two parties, what the interests of the American people are, and how the parties capture and reflect those interests. And we're doing this because there's so much division. People say this is the nastiest, most partisan political environment since the American Civil War, in which members of the parties can't stand each other. People can't go to Thanksgiving dinners with members of their family without, disagreeing with each other and so forth. And so what is this really all about? And what we want to do tonight is give you our views of what this is about, how America operates. Look, we're not asking for any money. We're not running for office. We're not looking for any votes. We don't have to, deceive you. We don't have to say yes to you if we disagree. We don't have to make you like us. We're just going to tell you the truth. And it struck me that there might be a use for old politicians and people who've been involved in truth-telling in this country. And that's why, we try to form this, and we're trying to come here. We're still, getting started. And what we hope will happen is that we will play a small but important role in educating the electorate, because this country is only going to survive as a democracy if people really pay attention to government. It can't be done just on the first line of the lead paragraph in the newspaper. And it can't be done just on a soundbite in the news. It's like if we follow government the way I follow the World Series, we're going to end up in a crisis. Now, I like the Boston Red Sox, don't get me wrong. I campaigned in New Hampshire off and on for like 7 months, 16 years ago. So I became a Redskins fan and I became a Patriots fan. And Arkansas doesn't have any conflict with that because we don't have any professional sports team. So I still watch it really closely. But I don't watch baseball until October. And if Americans don't follow politics until they head to the ballot box on election day, this country is not going to make it. So it's about really engaging the electorate. So if we're successful tonight, some of you are going to come onto our website and sign up and be with us. And we're going to work through issues. And we're going to help you when these candidates come and you meet them in a coffee shop or you go over to someone's house. You're going to ask them the real question. You're not going to let them slide by with a slick comment, a joke, a smile, and say, gee, I really like that person. That's not enough for America. Not today. So that's the purpose behind it. Now, what I wanted to say, just by way of introduction, is look, I was really lucky. I got to run for the highest office in the land. I never thought I could do something like that. It just happened. And what happened is I wrote an op-ed saying there was no reason to go to war with Iraq when we did. And I became Ted Kennedy's favorite general. And my wife had told me, she said, don't write that op-ed, you're going to make a lot of enemies. And, I couldn't keep my mouth shut. And so that's what happened, and I ended up getting drafted. And I spent 5 months in politics. We raised $23 million for the campaign. I won Oklahoma. I came in third up here behind the local favorites, John Kerry and Howard Dean, who had worked the state really closely. But then I had a political action committee for another 4 years. I got to go out and give a lot of speeches, meet a lot of people in politics. And so I've been at the highest level in the military, then running for the highest office in the land in politics, and then in a lot of business. So I've seen a lot of the country, and I wanted to give back. And here's what I want to say. This country runs in like 40 to 50 year political cycles. When I ran for office, they said, make sure you tell them, now this is the most important election in your lifetime. That's supposed to motivate you to come out and vote. And it was the most important election in my lifetime because I was in it. But actually, what happens in America is we move in long periods of time. After the Civil War, we industrialized America, and this was the so-called Gilded Age. And it lasted really until the turn of the century and a little bit beyond. It was 40 plus years of unbridled capitalism. Money poured into this country from overseas. We built the steel industry so we could have the railroad industry. And through the railroad industry, then we built agriculture, and we could ship agricultural products to market before they spoiled. And in the process, we discovered oil in Pennsylvania, and suddenly we built an oil industry. And by the turn of the century, there were trusts. There was a rail trust and an oil trust and so forth. And people had accumulated huge wealth. And at the bottom of it was labor. And there were no labor unions. And there was no socialism. And there was no safety net. And if you got your arm cut off as a train conductor trying to hitch up these Pullman cars, I mean, too bad. You weren't going to be employed anymore, and good luck to you. And you were going to starve out there, at least if you wanted to be a railroad worker. We didn't have safety standards and so forth. So what happened was people said enough's enough. And we moved into the next great era of American politics, which was the progressive era. It took 20 years before income tax could be collected. It took a constitutional amendment. The Supreme Court, always conservative, except in one specific era, always conservative, always slow, turned it down again and again and again. And finally, it took a constitutional amendment. Theodore Roosevelt set out to break the trusts. Woodrow Wilson stole the program from the Republican Party when he was elected and continued with the progressive era. And then it was finally finished by, Franklin Roosevelt put in Social Security, but really it was Lyndon Johnson who finished the progressive era dream of medical care. And that was in the late 1960s. So you could consider that was like a 60-year cycle. And then, like we used to say in the Army, anything worth doing is worth overdoing. And so there was a reaction to it. And the reaction to it started with Barry Goldwater, a senator from Arizona, and then came through Ronald Reagan, who had been the governor in California, who saw clearly that government can only do so much. It has inefficiencies. It doesn't have the incentives of the private sector. And it doesn't know everything. And people don't necessarily work as hard in government. And so this is the third great era of American society. This is the age of Reagan. And both Democrats and Republicans subscribed to the same general philosophy. It was reduce taxes, try to not have government debt, reduce government influence in the marketplace, stop the regulations, or at least regulate less. And so from Reagan through President George H.W. Bush, through President Clinton, through President George W. Bush, through Obama, and now into Donald Trump, we're still marching to the same general drumbeat. People call it neoliberalism. And it's been 40 years. And now you can see on the left of the Democratic Party, the anger is building. Well, first there was Occupy Wall Street in 2010, but there was a bunch of crazies. They didn't even have a program. They were just sort of camped out on Wall Street, and there was no field sanitation, as we would say in the Army. So that wasn't going anywhere. And then, people had ideas, and Bernie Sanders started to take off in 2016. But who was Bernie Sanders? He wasn't even a member of the Democratic Party. He was like a socialist. And what was this about? And Democrats are sort of, Democrats know how to govern, and who is Sanders? And now you can see the movement swelling. So you're sensing the end of an era in American politics. It might end in 2020, it might end in 2024, it might end in 2028. But what you're sensing is the motive force of the people that's coming out in the anger in the politics. When we went from the Gilded Age to the Progressive Era, there were fierce labor strikes. The troops were called out. Strikers were shot. They beat scabs. They called them scabs. They were the people that came in to do the work in the factories when the union workers were on strike. And, people were killed in these riots all over the Northeast. It was vicious. It was ugly. But people said, okay, this is the way it works. Until finally we sorted out through labor laws, really, that emerged in the Depression. And what you're seeing now is the energy that's going to try to move this system away from 40 years of the age of Reagan. So when you think about the arguments you see, then you have to put it in context. We've been through this before. America is a tough place. Democracy is people's expression. People feel strongly about what they feel. And so you can't be shocked that there are demonstrations and people are angry and so forth. It's the way the system's worked. And no, the next election is not going to be the most important election in your lifetime. There'll be an election after that, and after that, and after that. And the country swings back and forth. So that's the perspective I wanted to share before we talk about specific issues. Thank you.
Secretary Carter.
Thank you, Wayne. Thank New England College for hosting us. Thank you for being here. Thank you for living in New Hampshire, those of you who do. It is a pretty dynamic place to live, especially in the political climate. And thank you for the kind introduction. It was way too long, and you left two things out. I am proudly married to my wife, who I met in the 5th grade. She's right back there. And she has been a tremendous blessing, not only to me, but to lots of other people. And you also didn't say that I ran for governor of Massachusetts. And that's because it was a forgettable experience. I do have to tell you, though, on the night that after the election, I was standing at a hotel in Boston in a ballroom that had been set up, and my campaign volunteers were there, and the media, and they were covering me. And I took the stage with my family, and I said I was very proud of my 3rd place finish in the Republican primary. And my son, who was 7 at the time, was standing right beside me, yanked my pant leg and said, "Dad, you came in last." I preferred to think of it as 3rd, so thank you for not reminding me. But if General Clark says that it's the end of an era, I prefer to think of it more optimistically, it's the beginning of an era. And once again, New Hampshire has a chance to be part of the beginning. New Hampshire has got the highest level of participation in democracy of any state in the Union. The state legislature has a lot of members. You know who they are. You know where they live. You can talk to them. They respond to you. Every town, and there are lots of towns in New Hampshire, has a select board and a planning board and a school committee. You know where they live and you can talk to them. That is a great luxury in a democracy that is a republic. You know who your representatives are and they respond to you. New Hampshire has also been the place where if you wanted to be president of the United States, you had to come to New Hampshire. Most people who want to become president of the United States don't want to come to New Hampshire. But you have to come to New Hampshire. And it's because in New Hampshire, you know that the most important word in the Constitution is the first word, we. It's our government. It's not the government's government. It's not the government representative's government. It's not corporate America's government. It's not the UN's government. It's our government. And New Hampshire understands that with great passion. And that's why New Hampshire is the place where candidates were expected to come to be challenged. To be challenged. And New Hampshire has a long history of demonstrating how tough that challenge is. Because New Hampshire has truly made presidents and denied presidents. So thank you for being part of the we. Too few people today run away from government rather than toward it, but it is our government, so I've got to encourage you to run for it. Run toward government and participate. And General Clark is right to remind us of from whence we came. That our democracy actually has evolved for a long time. And it has picked up a lot of good lessons, Some were lessons we're glad we learned so we don't repeat them. Other lessons we learned so that we can repeat them and see them manifested. Right now, there is a greater challenge than I think there has ever been in our democracy. And it's a challenge that New Hampshireites should understand the most. Because in New Hampshire, by definition, the way the government is organized, you are very close to the government. You are very close to it. Most governments in our country do not have constituents who are as close as the constituents in New Hampshire are to their government. So you hound your government leaders, your representatives. You hound them. You see them at the local market basket, the grocery store, the Dunkin' Donuts, the gas station. You know who they are. You tell them what you think. Sometimes you scream at them. Sometimes you give them a hug. Most politicians in America don't have that luxury, except they can get a tweet or they can send one out. But if you get a tweet, you don't see the expression of the face. You don't see the gesture of the hands. You don't get the benefit of a hug. And you may not even feel the same emotion. But that kind of relationship with our government today is actually challenging our government. And New Hampshire can help the rest of the world understand the responsibility of being so close to government. I live in Jaffrey, southwest corner of New Hampshire, only about 15 miles from the Massachusetts border. We have not been infected yet. We are very close to our government, but we treat people in that government pretty well. No, I'm not talking about well by paying them a salary. They don't make much money in New Hampshire in politics. We treat them well because we respect their service. And I have been to town meetings when there were tough arguments being made. I've seen the state representative stand up and be told to sit down. But I've also seen hands being shaken when they walk out the room, and a pat on the back, or gratitude for service. I've been also at town meetings where they said, it's your turn to run next year, I don't want to do it again. And you help them do it. You know how to have a dialogue that may be firm and hard, but is almost always respectful for the sacrifice that is being made by service. Because you know somebody who serves on the school committee, or in the planning board, or on the school select board. You know what it's like. You know how tough it is to go to Concord to have a state legislative meeting, and all you get is your travel expenses and not much else. And then you're ignored. But you participate. The dialogue that we have as individuals in New Hampshire is kind of exciting. But I'm reminded with something my grandmother, who was a suffragette, told me. And she fought for women to get to the right to vote. She participated in her government. She made sure all of her children and all of the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren participated in their democracy. She respected that first word in the Constitution. But she also told us something else. Taste your words before you spit them out. If we would all taste our words before we spit them out, they would sound better when they land on somebody else's ear, and they may pay attention. I would say you should probably lick your thumbs before you tweet your words out. Because your words do drive democracy. So civil dialogue is critically important. I want to understand your words, and I'd like you to understand my words. Give thought to the words you use. Demand that your political leaders give thoughts to the words that they use, and we will have a better dialogue. So My last thing is, in New Hampshire, it's pretty easy to become a mob because you can go to a town meeting. And I've seen the mob show up. Okay? But the good news is, mobs don't make the decisions. They may inform the decision, they don't make it. Today, the internet looks a lot like the mob. A tweet looks a lot like a mob march. Don't allow politicians and representatives in our republic to make the decisions based on mob rule. We want judgment, we want wisdom, and we want representation. I don't want people to do just what I say to do when I'm angry. I want them to take my anger, calibrate it to the right level, and see if it's informative or not. If it's not informative, ignore my anger. Acknowledge that you heard it, but you can ignore it when it comes to passing the law in the legislature, or voting for a budget on the school committee, or deciding where a curb cut should be in a highway. So with that, civil dialogue makes a difference. It makes New Hampshire a great place to campaign because you're not afraid to speak the words, and you do usually taste them before you spit them out. You just want to see what they come out with on the other side. Did they taste them, or they just echo you back? Thank you.
So as I mentioned, I have a few questions for you, and mostly they're specific policy questions. I'm going to start though with a context question. It seems to me part of the premise for today's discussion is the notion that as Americans, what unites us is much greater than what divides us. I think it's fair to say that many Americans are questioning that assertion these days, given what they see in the traditional and social media, and frankly, given the anger that we hear quite a bit associated with different campaigns, especially last cycle, whether it was Bernie Sanders' campaign or Donald Trump's campaign. I guess my question for you is, in the face of what I think is growing cynicism, what's your way forward? How do you speak to that and sort of get, as Secretary Card said earlier, folks from cynicism back to skepticism?
Well, I think that, you're looking at me, Wayne, so I guess I'm going to start on this. I'm not sure I've got the ultimate answers on it. But government has to work for the people. But government is representative government. We're in a republic, and we want experts to work for us. You know, one of the things that's very interesting in my home state of Arkansas is we went to term limits about 25 years ago. And it was a partisan ploy, honestly. There were a lot of Democrats who'd been there a long time in the state legislature, and so people argued for term limits. They said, let's get those people out. Well, Republicans then had a chance to come in. The legislature today is heavily Republican in both houses in Arkansas. And so it served the function. We got new people in office. But actually, what happened with term limits is that we ended up with a less expert group of representatives. In the old days, people would stay every 2 years there's elections. They'd stay there 10, 12, 14, 18 years in the General Assembly or in the state Senate. And now they don't. So what happened is they bring the fresh ideas from people who were not in government into the government. But actually when they get there, they find government, it's pretty complicated. It's pretty tough. And when they say, well, let's do this. Well, you can't do that because somebody's going to say, well, the Constitution of the state says that that's not an appropriate thing. Well, find a way to do it. Well, when they say that, they turn to the lobbyists, the people who aren't elected, the people who are there that represent some interest. Now, American government's built on interests. That's the way we wrote the Constitution. That's what Federalist Paper 51 says. Let interest counteract interest and ambition counteract ambition. But it's better if it's done by people who understand it in the context and then stand for their results and are held accountable at the election, rather than by people who aren't elected, who are whispering in the dark about what to do. And so sometimes what you try to do in government backfires on you. So I'm a believer that term limits kind of, at least in the case of my home state of Arkansas, they backfired. They didn't work as well. So we want government to work for the people. We want experts and competence in government. And if we have that, then we'll get respect for government. Just one more thought, if I could, Wayne. About 40 years ago, as we were entering the age of Reagan, Reagan gained a lot of popularity by talking about the problems of government. And I had seen these firsthand when I was a young man in the Ford administration. One of the things I did for the director of OMB was go to the Congress with diagrams of all the overlapping government programs. We called them mess charts. And so if you were a woman with a family, there were like 6 different subcommittees or committees that would provide nutrition and milk for your baby. And each member of Congress who was on one of those committees was jealous, and they demanded the right to hold on to that program even though it was overlapping with another committee's program. So these were really hard to clean up. And President Reagan came in and he saw all this. He'd seen it as governor of California. And he made jokes about it. He said, you know, the worst 13 words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And he would say, you know, government's like a baby. You put food in at the top and, well, you know what comes out at the bottom. And, you know, it was the way Reagan was. He had that charm about him. You had to laugh. And yet, it took away something that Americans believed in government. We got the interstate highway system not by going to the private market and saying, hey, how don't you guys build a bunch of toll roads that connect across the country? No, it was a vision that actually was during World War II, and Ike picked it up and put it in the 1950s. We got the space program not because some billionaire said, you know, ever since I was a kid, I wondered what was on the backside of the moon, and I think now that I've got a few $1 billion, we're going to find out. No, it was Kennedy as the president who gave America a task that brought us together. The greatest things we've ever done as a country were the things we did in common with each other. And it's our government that has to set that vision out. When former Speaker of the House and Congressman Newt Gingrich ran for president in 2012, I was struck because he said, we want to put 13,000 people on the moon. And Andy, I don't know, you may know what was behind that. I don't. I thought it was an odd thing to put 13,000 people on the moon. I mean, why not 15? But it was a vision. And
Newt could only count to 13.
Huh? Yep.
Newt could only count to 13.
I guess. I don't know. He was trying to say, you know, America has to have dreams, and we have to have government to pull those dreams together and make them reality. I think we need some big vision, some big dreams for this country to get people on the same side and moving forward.
The challenge today is that we don't have as much participation in our government as we used to. And it's because I bet you most of you say if you're grandparents, you're not telling your grandchild, you're going to grow up and be president someday. Or if you're a parent telling your child, I hope that you'll grow up and can't wait to see you run for the legislature or for the Senate. We don't invite people to be part of government today as parents. And when I was growing up, I did have grandparents that kind of expected us to run for office. They certainly expected us to vote, and they wanted us to vote. So I think part of it is our fault that we are not contagious with participation in our government. We're cynical about it. We complain about it. Seldom do we cheer it. We may pretend to cheer it every once in a while, but we usually don't cheer it. And the truth is, in politics, if you're running for office, every politician wants to run a campaign that says, love me, love me, love me. But the truth is, you motivate a vote by saying, fear them, fear them, fear them. So vote me as the alternative to that which you fear. And I don't think we're ever going to change that, because fear actually markets more than love, because it generates more emotion. But I wish that we could say, thank you for running for office. I hope that you will run. I love to see people running for office, even though I don't want them to represent me. I am perfectly happy to have them run for office and give me a chance to vote for their opponent. But run for office. Don't run away for it, run for it. So I think the solution to our problem is to demonstrate to the rest of the world that we should be part of our government. We're going to be part of our government. We're going to run. We're going to vote. We're going to get engaged. We're going to show up. We'll be respectful. And Wayne mentioned this. I did say that today most America, well, I'll say most Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is very tribal today. And Democrats don't talk to Republicans. They're not allowed to be seen with Democrats or Republicans. It's tribal. And it used to be that you kind of got stuck in Washington, D.C., and you had to be friends with people you didn't think you would like, and you became friends with them. Congress was like that. Now Congress doesn't do that. Why? As the general said, we passed some laws that we demanded as people. Term limits was one example. You know, changing leadership in the House and the Senate so you couldn't be chairman of a committee very long. No more earmarks. And by the way, don't listen to anybody who knows anything. I am very proud of a label that I take. I am proud to be called a politician. Do you know anybody that is proud to be called a politician? Vote for me, I'm a politician. It's lousy bumper sticker, nobody would vote for you. But the truth is, if you've got a bumper sticker, you are a politician. And it's okay, it's good, it's noble. But I also know that no politician is as smart as they claim to be. And they need to be educated. And who educates them? We do. We educate them. I also know that no bureaucrat in government is as smart as they need to be. Because bureaucrats are trained to make decisions based on yesterday. Yesterday we did this is the way it should be done. Business people come in and say, but I'm focused on tomorrow because I'm trying to build a product or create a climate for tomorrow. So I'd like my regulation to reflect tomorrow, not yesterday. I'm sorry, I don't have that vision. I can only look at yesterday. So every bureaucrat needs to be educated. Unfortunately, if you educate a politician or a bureaucrat more than 3 times, you're a lobbyist. And that title is even worse than the title politician. And yet, I like lobbyists. I say that because I see them as educators. I want to be educated. I want our politicians and our bureaucrats to be educated. To me, that's the solution. Don't run away from it. Run toward it. Be an educator. Teach them. You can teach them with a little bit of emotion, but it's better to use facts that they will never forget. So, fact-based, I'm an engineer by training. It's an oxymoron that I'm a politician. I know that. But truly, I don't know whether I'm the oxy or the moron. But educate the politicians and the bureaucrats to do a better job, and they'll do it.
So let's talk some specific policy. Immigration factored largely in the 2016 election. President Trump would like to make it a major focus of his re-elect effort. His would-be Democratic challengers, while differing on some of the details, are uniformly opposed to much of the president's approach to immigration. Is there common ground on this issue of immigration? What would your advice to elected officials be in terms of finding that common ground? Secretary Carter, sorry.
Immigration didn't become a problem just with President Donald J. Trump. Immigration was a problem for the 3 previous presidents, and they all wrestled with many of the same challenges that we talk about today. The magnitude was different. I think the volume of people, in part because of the marketing in America, that there's a problem. So we exacerbated the problem by highlighting the problem. And we exacerbated the problem by highlighting solutions to the problem that were put in place that generated more unintended consequences than intended results, which is a great segue into policy. That could be one word, policy. I guarantee all of you think you have good policy ideas. Policy is about the easiest thing to make up. We wake up every morning very smart, and we think if they would only do this, that would be the right answer. And one of the great challenges of being a chief of staff is the chief of staff's job has 3 functions: the care and feeding of a president. You should want to be president. You're well cared for, and you're well fed. Policy formulation, that's what you think it's all about, and there's lots of policy formulation at the White House. And then if the president makes a decision and nobody knows about it, did the president make a decision? No. So the last part is communicating the president's decision to the right people at the right time with the right expectations so it'll be done. But the policy part of that is funny because people think it's the hardest part of the job. It's the easiest part of the job because almost everybody has a view on policy. So you get lots of views. The challenge for the chief of staff is making sure nobody is dominating a view on policy. You want all of the policy to express lots of different views, and then you want a process to say, how would this be implemented? Who will understand it? Who's impacted by it? What difference will it make? How do we know that it's working? That's a process. When President Trump, and I'll answer your question on immigration right here. The first policy put in place by President Trump was an executive order on immigration. Who can get off a plane at JFK? Who can cross the border in Texas or in California? If they come in, do you let them in the country? And he put an executive order out saying that we're going to make it more difficult to come into the country. And it was a pretty simple policy because he talked about it during the campaign and we applauded. And then he wrote the policy, and the policy was put in place, but there was no process to it. So literally, one of the first consequences was a gentleman from Iraq who had served our military very well as a translator. And he was promised that he could come to the United States and get a green card and be engaged in our economy and bring his family. He lands at JFK, he gets off the plane, and they say, you can't come in. He said, but I was told I could come in. Well, you can't come in under this executive order. And he was put on the plane and sent back. That made the news. It became big news. I guarantee it was an unintended consequence. If they had had a process and said, how are we going to deal with the people who come in because we promised them they could come in? How do we deal with a dad in the United States who is a green card holder, whose job requires him to go to Europe and then come back to the United States with the green card? Those were all exceptions that should have easily been understood. They were not included in the policy, so they were defined by the policy. They then gave definition to the policy. So whatever Donald Trump says on immigration is defined more by unintended consequences, by intended consequences. That's why you need to have a process at the White House and in any policy place that doesn't say your policy will be implemented. Instead, it says your policy will be reviewed to see how it will be implemented and if the results are what we expect. Again, Congress would love to change a bunch of laws. They can't change the law of gravity. If I drop my pen, it will fall to the floor. No matter how many times they change the law of gravity, it won't change it. They also haven't found a way to change the law of unintended consequences. They also don't know how to change the law of competitive advantage. They may try, but they can't do it. So that's what we have to recognize. We should understand a process will help to inform what a policy should be, and that's how I would address especially the immigration issue, because there are many more unintended consequences with the immigration policy than there are intended ones. Sorry.
So, Andy, what you're saying is you got to have a good policy process. And what you're implying is that making policy by tweet is a bad way to make policy, because
Even if you do lick your thumbs.
so, but let me put this in a political context and tell you what I'm worried about. Look, we're a nation of immigrants, and yet we've always been afraid of immigrants. This has been the great characteristic of America from the very beginning. We never liked the immigrants. From the very first people that came to this country, the Native Americans, they kept the English settlers from getting into Massachusetts for like 80 years until we finally found someone who could speak English, and he bartered away to enable a Massachusetts Bay Colony to settle. And after the first English settlers came, then they didn't like the people that came afterwards. And then, boy, in the 19th century did we have a problem, because we were flooded with the darn Irish, and people hated the Irish. They stayed by themselves. They were Roman Catholics. They were, they had allegiance to the Pope. And who were these people that were slum dwellers and so forth? Now, my wife is Irish Catholic from Brooklyn, and she and her grandparents remember the signs that said, "Irish need not apply for work in New York City." But then there were the Italians, and everybody knew the Italians. They're from south of the Alps, so they're not as good as the Irish. And so each wave of immigrants has met opposition, including the ones who came from the south. And but talking about immigration, it's a dog whistle, because it generates fear. Fear for my property, fear for my job, fear for my children's education. And everybody knows those kids that come from Asia, there's something about them. They're just better in science and mathematics, and they shouldn't be entitled to that special treatment that they get. I mean, if you read Amy Chua's book on how she did motherhood, and how her grandfather told her, that her father told her, "Don't you ever come home or ever invite me to a ceremony where you're not the best in the ceremony." There's a standard that comes from families. And so America's been incredibly strengthened by the waves of immigration. And that continues to be the case. We could have 600 million people in America and have plenty of room for people. I mean, my state of Arkansas is frankly underpopulated. We're never going to win a game in football against Alabama unless we double the number of people in the state, because we can't get enough recruits. But it's a dog whistle, and it evokes fear. So it's in play in politics today, and it has been for the last decade, as we've wrestled with the problem of what do we do with the kids who were brought to the country by their parents. The parents didn't have papers. They got in, and now the kids have grown up here, and they're not legal. They don't have any citizenship. These are the DACA kids. They go to college. They participate in the economy, but they hide out because they don't have papers. Shouldn't we do? You can't send them back to Mexico. They've never been in Mexico. That's not their home. We have to get an answer for this. But the problem with it is that it's a dog whistle issue. And so there's an effort today to make the Democrats the party of illegal immigrants. And you hear it on the stump. Question is, can we get past the dog whistle and really deal with the immigration issue? It seems to me that what you've got to have is, first, you've got to acknowledge the country is not full. Not by a long shot. There's plenty of room for good people in this country. Not just PhDs, not just electrical engineers, but ordinary people who want to have a good life, raise a family, pay taxes, and be responsible citizens, and live in safety. We need those people in America, and we've needed them for a long time. Secondly, you got to be fair with the people who have grown up here and have no place else to go. And we need to resolve that. And then third, you've got to have a way that people can come here and be safe. And there are various pockets of that. Some people come here as economic refugees. Some people come here because their lives are threatened. And in the 1980s and 90s, the American economy grew because in comparison with all our European rivals, we were the only ones that had a growing population. And we loved it. I remember after 9/11, Andy, I was giving a speech to the American Home Builders Association. And they told me, they said, General, for God's sake, don't go after illegal immigration. There are 11 million illegal immigrants here, and they're the ones that hold up the whole housing market. And if you got rid of them, the whole value in the real estate market would collapse. So, and these men weren't Democrats. These men were Republicans, and they were men. And that's how they do it. So you've got to get underneath the dog whistle and the partisanship to look at the specific elements of what is common, solid immigration policy. And we have to demand that our people who are running for office come to terms with that. This idea that anyone could cross in the border and without paperwork and it's not a crime, come on. No, that can't be. There's no such thing as a country that has open borders. People just show up and then they sign up. No, you can't have that. And if you ask Democrats about it, Democrats will tell you, no, they don't believe. We're not the party of illegal immigration. We're not encouraging everybody from Central America to move here and sign up for Medicaid. We've got to have a process. But somehow, underneath the partisanship here, we've got to get Congress and the White House to agree on a policy. Otherwise, it's just about finger pointing and electioneering and raising money for the electioneering. And I hope when these candidates come to New Hampshire that you'll raise this immigration issue. Maybe it's not the greatest immigration issue here. It's more along the Texas border and into California and maybe Florida. But please raise it. Make them address this in a reasonable policy framework, not as simply slogans. It's not enough to say, well, we're a nation of immigrants and people shouldn't be put in jail. Agree. What's the policy that you're recommending? And it's not enough on the other side to say, we can't have these people coming to America. They don't represent our standards. They're not our kind of people. We don't want them here. That's not the answer either. So whatever your political party is, I hope you'll force the people who are running for office to address this issue. Because this issue is a real dog whistle in American politics today. It raises the temperature. It divides people, and it shouldn't.
You can't hold a town hall meeting in New Hampshire with Democratic candidates without them rattling off any number of statistics related to the economy, never painting a good picture. So I went back and I looked it up just on the unemployment question. Unemployment rate in August, last data that I could find, August 2019, national unemployment rate is 3.7%, the lowest since December 1969. I think most people would agree that on its face value, that's a good number. And yet wage growth has not followed suit. Despite the competitive and tight labor market, wages have not risen in a proportional manner. What's more, we've seen greater interest in union activity. We've just seen a series of actions in the Midwest and manufacturing states. Union activity is on the increase, it seems, particularly in states with a strong history, with a strong history of manufacturing. Is there a common ground approach to economic growth, free trade, that also takes care of workers? And so I started with Andy last time. I'll go to you, General Paul.
Yeah, that's the $64 million question, I think, because I think economic insecurity is the greatest factor motivating, at least on the Democratic side in this election. It's insecurity about can they get health care, insecurity about can they pay for college, insecurity about how do they get out of debt, insecurity about can they keep a job. You know, 9 of the 10 largest employers in this country are not businesses. They're financial firms like Apollo. They control the businesses and they run on the Excel spreadsheet. Now, I'm an investment banker and so I understand Excel spreadsheets, but if you don't, let me just explain to you that it's a matrix with a bunch of columns And there's formulas that are behind the numbers in each column. And so when you're in the workplace and you say, but we need 3 people to do this job because occasionally, they have to take their wife to the hospital or the child is sick and they have to stay home and stuff. And so it makes sense to have 3 people, even though we could probably do it with 2, because if one's missing, and the analyst who runs the Excel spreadsheet said, really? Well, how many times are people going absent? Do you have the records of that? And is that 20% of the time that there's a third person, one of the 3 missing? And then what's that worth? And how much is it costing you when they're missing? And then how much is it costing you to have the third person there? And when you start looking at it in dollars and cents terms, it blows away employment. I'm an Army guy, and we used to talk in the Army about how do you organize. So in the United States Army, we had 5 tanks per platoon, 3 platoons per company, 3 companies per battalion. So when we said reorganize, to me, that meant, maybe we shouldn't have 5 tanks in a platoon. The Russians only had 3. The Israelis had 4. But then if you have only 3 tanks, do you have 4 platoons in a company? And then, or maybe you have 4 companies in a battalion. Because how do you get your combat power there? But that's not what reorganization means in business. Reorganization in business means how many people can you eliminate? How many organizations can you eliminate so that you reduce the cost, so you raise your profit? What I learned as an investment banker is that actually if you save $1 in a business and you're publicly traded, it raises the value of your company by about $6. And people, they may go to work for a firm and they don't understand it, but when they see reorganization, they pretty quickly get it. So it's economic insecurity. That's the issue that's facing us today. How can we deal with the economic insecurity? Seems to me there's 3 or 4 different principles. Number one is we had an idea that was taught in the business school called shareholder theory of value. Under shareholder theory of value, we taught a generation of young people becoming businessmen that the only thing that matters is the profit to the people who own the company. So it doesn't matter what you do to the community. It doesn't matter what happens to the workers. They don't count. And government is supposed to help the shareholders because they're the ones that are giving to the political campaigns. So one thing is we're now in the process of looking at the consequences, and business schools now are softening their approach to shareholder theory of value. Now they want to talk about stakeholders. So it's not just the owners, it's the workers, it's the people who loan the business money, it's the community that gave them tax breaks. So I think that's one way to do this. But I think, honestly, we're in a different era. And just to pick up something that Secretary Card said in the introduction, this is the first time in human history that if you look around the globe at the 7.5 billion people and you say, but actually, there's like 1 billion acres of unused agricultural land for growing food. And there's plenty of wealth and capital out there. There's no reason for any child to go hungry. There's no reason for any family in Africa, Asia, or North America or South America to be homeless. There's no reason for anyone not to have an education. It could be provided. The question is whether we're adroit enough to move forward. For 10,000 years of human history, we've been an exploitative society. That's what it took. You had to compete. You competed to see who could kill the deer, who got the best piece of meat, who had the best plot of land, who could control his borders better. I was in Africa, and a woman told me that she couldn't take water out of the stream that ran right in front of her house. She had to walk a mile up the mountain because the chief said it belonged to other people, and she had to follow the instructions of the chief. But we have technology today. We have wealth. That's what 10,000 years of human civilization has given us. So, Wayne, you're asking a question really about the structure of society. And I'm not up here to preach socialism. I don't even know what the word would mean today. But I do know that there has to be a way of moving forward that's more cooperative, that brings people together more, that recognizes that when people are in a firm and the firm is making a profit, their workers, they deserve a share of those profits. I was in the Caterpillar plant in 2012 looking at putting renewable energy out there in Peoria. I've seen a lot of plants. I'm an Army guy who does heavy equipment, so I know how to maintain stuff. And I looked at this factory and it was spotless and the equipment was great and people really knew what they were doing. And that year, Caterpillar had record profits. They were selling their mining equipment all over the world. It had exploded. And the workers said, oh, wait a minute, you know, you got record profits. Why can't, I mean, we're the ones building this stuff. Why can't we have a hike in our wages? And the people at Caterpillar said, well, because actually we're looking ahead and next year might not be as good as this year. So therefore, we're not going to give you any, we're going to get the bonuses, but you don't. Because we're the ones in charge and we're thinking ahead. So the people on Caterpillar went on strike. Strike lasted 6 weeks. The strike fund was exhausted. Unemployment rate at the time was like probably 7 or 8%. And other workers came in and the union said after 6 weeks, okay, we want our jobs back. And the workers took a pay cut and the executives got the bonuses for breaking the strike. Now we have to be able to do better than that as we move forward. This is what we've learned through the Excel spreadsheet, is how not to give wage increases. I hate to say it, but if you look at the record of every recession since the 1970s, we've gotten better and better and better at protecting corporate profits at the expense of letting workers go. We learn not to have long-term contracts. We have short-term people who work for us. We learn not to have fixed expenses like a contributory retirement program that has defined benefits. Instead, we let the workers fend for themselves. And it's added to corporate profits. Corporate profits have grown from like 6 or 7% of the economy to 12 to 15% of the economy over the last 20 years. Record levels going to corporate profits. That's a good thing. That's what businesses are taught to do. But we have to keep it in balance, and that's the role for government. So you ask a really great question, and I've talked all the way around it, but there's no magic solution on this.
I do think that the stimulus that has happened in the last 2.5 years in the economy came with tax reform. I didn't agree with every aspect of the tax reform. I really missed the state and local tax deductions. Okay, and they disproportionately punished New Hampshire. But I do like the reforms that were generally in the tax code, making it a little bit simpler. I also think the deregulation that became a conscience in the administration, in all the bureaucracies, has helped to kind of give a little more creative juice to the entrepreneurs that come up with solutions to new problems. So some of those things that are happening that contribute to the growth in our economy. I do think our economy is surprisingly strong. An unemployment rate of 3.7%. When I was in college, that was full employment. 4% was full employment. 5% was considered to be virtually full employment. So 3.7% means that there is a dearth of workers. And there are lots of jobs available in New Hampshire today. New Hampshire Ball Bearing, Millipore, for example, I know they want to hire more people. They can't, but which is a good transition into education. We need to do more with education to allow young people to learn trades as well as business practices. And I would also like to see us have more internships in work environments so that young people actually experience work before they're asked to do it. And it could make a difference. Generations ago, you got to work on the farm. Today, you're not taught to work very many places in society today. So I think we should do more to encourage people to have interns starting at a pretty young age, 14, 15, 16 years old, I think.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more, and we've been going for a little bit over an hour. I'm going to ask one more, and then I'm going to ask you all to pitch in and ask some questions as well of our guests here. I want to shift gears to foreign policy, if that's okay. I was reading an article the other day, and it made reference to Arthur Vandenberg. So if you don't know who Arthur Vandenberg was, he was a United States Senator just after World War II, and he was critical to the effort of getting the North Atlantic Treaty signed, which ultimately leads to the formation of NATO. And he had this quote that's always used, you may have heard it, politics stops at the water's edge. And the context of that was he was in a position to oppose President Truman on moving forward in the transatlantic alliance and what ultimately becomes NATO. So for many years, it seemed to me that foreign policy, national security policy was that one place that partisanship, it was some reluctance for folks to get too partisan about it. That seems to have changed really after the Cold War. But there was this moment. This opportunity after the Cold War where the United States became the last great superpower of the world. And on that day in August when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the international community came together in a way that we really had never seen before. It really was a special moment. And you saw countries that hadn't been the best of friends with the United States line up their soldiers with our soldiers on that frontier in Saudi Arabia, ready to push Saddam out of Kuwait. It really was, as I say, a special moment. It doesn't seem to me that we've had many of those moments since then. It seems to me that in the years that followed, American standing in the world has taken a hit. I would say the immediate response after 9/11 would be an exception of that. The world came together for America. But there's not a lot of examples of that, and partisanship seems to have taken a much bigger role. So my question for you is a little convoluted here, but it's really about, can we get to a place where what America means to the world, that indispensable power to the world that Madeleine Albright described, can we get back to a place where there's a consensus around that? And I'll throw it to you first, General, but I certainly would love to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I think there was generally a consensus during the Cold War. Sure. And when Ike gave his inaugural speech in 1953, he said that Democrats and Republicans may disagree at home, but we have to work together abroad to prevent the evil of Marxism, Leninism, and the spread of communism. And I think that every president after that, through President George H. Bush, followed more or less that same model. They disagreed politically with their opponents, but they always could count on the fact that, Democrats were always a little bit different. Democrats are always like, hey, let's call the lawyers. Can't we have a conference on this? Can't we, reasonable people, agree? And Republicans were always like, hey, those people are going to take advantage of you. You better get some more weapons in there. They're going to cheat on you. But despite that, there was still a broad 60, 70% consensus. That broke down when we lost our adversary in 1991. At that point, the Cold War was over, and there was a struggle to define a new strategy. I came to Washington in 1994, and there was no strategy. I was called in by General Shalikashvili, and I was a director of strategy, plans, and policy for the Joint Staff. And I'd been on the job about 5 days, and he said, Wes, tell me, what is this strategy we have? I was like, this is like a test question from your boss. And I said, sir, I don't know. He says, neither do I. You have to figure this out. And so we never really could create a strategy that brought America together again. We published a strategy document, but the Republicans never quite accepted it. And I remember during the time that I was in Washington during that period, there was a sense that, President Clinton was a draft dodger. And he smoked marijuana. Now, I know he didn't inhale it. That's what he said. But, if you smoke marijuana, you can't get a security clearance. And those of us in uniform, my age, we all went to Vietnam. We didn't think that much of draft dodgers. And even though he wasn't technically a draft dodger because he didn't actually get drafted, His reputation was he was a draft dodger. And Republicans have always been the daddy party, and Democrats are the mommy party. Democrats are always nicer and kinder and sweeter. Republicans are like, hey, I'm harder. And so in the 1990s, this fissure grew in American policy. When we wanted to enlarge NATO, we got some real resistance from the Republicans on the Hill. I remember my friend Senator Kay Bailey Hutchinson saying, well, how much is this going to cost us? And would we have to go to war to protect them? And can these countries pay for their own defense? These were, tough questions. And when National Security Advisor Tony Lake testified on the Bosnia peace plan and said we're only going to be there for a year, that was strongly criticized. And during my campaign in Kosovo, there was a congressional resolution and to support the actions to end ethnic cleansing in Kosovo with the air campaign. And it didn't pass the House, led by Republican Majority Leader Tom DeLay. It was voted down. The Republicans voted against it uniformly, while we had airmen dodging missiles over Baghdad. So you couldn't say that there was unanimity in foreign policy, because really what happened was Americans forgot about foreign policy. And so everything was up for grabs, partisan-wise. I remember giving the first speech when I retired to a group out in Lake Tahoe, and they were technology people. And as I'm giving the speech about NATO and foreign policy, this guy's standing back at the back, he's talking to my wife and saying, your husband, okay, what's he talking to us about foreign policy for? We hire guys like him to take care of that. We're businessmen. We're interested in other things. Technology, foreign policy, that's not something we care about, really. What's he talking about it for? Then 9/11 happened, and America came together, and we created a strategy, and that was the strategy of the axis of evil, basically. And we went after them, and then it didn't work. It caused problems. We became overextended. We created a failed state, a civil war, and a terrorist operation against us in Iraq. Now, I give President Bush and you, Andy, a lot of credit, because it was the right thing to do to reinforce in the surge. We couldn't simply pull out with our tail between our legs. We couldn't do it. And that was a tough decision. But we haven't had any consensus since then. We just can't seem to bring the two sides together, and it's only gotten worse. It's a real challenge for us. Now, I think I should leave it at that and
I'm going to come at it a little bit differently. I'm going to break it into two parts. Foreign policy that is in the realm of the State Department and diplomacy and trade, U.S. Trade Representative's Office, that impacts how lots of the world sees us, interacts with us, what we do. I do believe we should have a respect that partisan politics stops at the water's edge, and let the president, who's got the constitutional responsibility, it's pretty clear in the Constitution, he speaks to the world for our country. We can yell and scream about him, but he speaks to the world. And at the water's edge, when the president is in Singapore meeting with Kim Jong-un or somebody else, I'm cheering for him. I want him to succeed. It's not partisan politics. When it comes to troops on the ground, that impacts neighborhoods at home. And it's very, very difficult to say politics won't play in that debate. It will, because it ends up being personal. And I understand that. But that's where the president has to be the commander-in-chief. Very different job, brutally tough job. That's the only part of the job of being president that doesn't leave them after they've left the presidency, because they know they cannot keep their oath of office. Their oath of office is the shortest oath taken by anybody. Article 2 in the Constitution, very short oath. There are people that make it possible for the president to keep his oath. And he couldn't do it without those people, because the president can't keep his oath by himself. He needs to have people who will serve in the military and the intelligence services, and they take an oath to follow the command of the commander-in-chief. And there is no conditional clause to it. It doesn't say, if I voted for him, if I agree with him, if he's a Democrat, or if he's a Republican. It doesn't even say, if the French agree. It just says, no, you follow the command of the commander-in-chief. That puts a burden on the president that never leaves them. Because there are people whose lives will be gone or changed forever, and he never intended that. But he owns it. So that's why you find former presidents being passionate in their passion for those who serve this country. And they carry that forever. It's a big burden. So politics, yes, I would like to see America viewed as speaking with the voice of the president in foreign policy, trade policy, and aspects. When it comes to the military, I want the president to speak as commander-in-chief to those who are following his command and teach us how to support those who are following his command and give them loyalty. Give them loyalty. Support our troops. Celebrate them when they come home. Pray for them when they're overseas. And that's what I think we should do as Americans. And we tend to want to complain about everything. Don't complain about the soldiers and the sailors and the airmen and the Coast Guardsmen and the intelligence service people who are doing a job, many that we will never know about, but boy, does it change their lives and it change our community lives. And let them know that you're with them. So.
Well, that's really well said, but I want to just follow before you turn to the audience on a couple of things. A friend of mine from Oxford was working for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and while there was a debate about one of the treaties, he had gone to Canada to stir up opposition in Canada to the matter that was being considered by the Congress. I thought that was incredibly disloyal. And I've seen this creeping out in America where people go abroad to complain against their country's policies. I think it's a terrible thing that's happened to this country. But we do need to get a national strategy, and we're not very good at it. We usually only have a strategy when there's a war. That's about the only time Americans can get together. And that's the real challenge for our democracy, to really think these issues through, because they become partisan. I was in NATO with General Al Haig when Jimmy Carter signed the agreement with Anwar Sadat to bring peace between Egypt and Israel. And I remember I was in his office with him when he got the news, and his face fell. It was like, because he was planning to run for president in 1980.
That's right.
And he knew that if you achieve a success in foreign policy, that boosts your standing in the polls. So when you do well as a president, you should get credit for it in your domestic politics. That's part of your competence. But you should not be using foreign policy as a trading material for your personal political advantage. That's the distinction. And that's what's at stake in America today. That's what the issue is.
We've got a few minutes. If you have a question, just raise your hand. We have students who have microphones. I'll bring them around to you, and we'll go. Yes, sir, in back. Yes. No.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment about the immigration issue. I was a history teacher. I still study history.
Sir, can you speak up?
Speak up.
I can also speak louder if necessary.
Politicians.
Anyways, one of my points has been in regards to immigration, the fact that historically in this country, when we were a country that was expanding, an optimistic country, someone could come like my great-grandparents from Ireland or England or Germany or Poland or whatever, and there were plenty of entry-level jobs because industry was expanding. There were a lot of places where people without educations could go to work at a low level, could work their way up, and provide for their children and perhaps send their children to college. Well, it seems now that those entry-level jobs, low-skill jobs that were so prevalent in this country when we were industrial, quote unquote, no longer exist because for the sake of whatever globalization or corporate profits or whatever, those jobs now exist in China or Vietnam or wherever they can be manufactured and exported to this country most favorably. So yes, we have physical room in this country for a lot of people, but where are the job opportunities for them? Where are those entry-level jobs that my great-grandparents took advantage of to begin their climb up the American ladder?
Well, with regard to, look, I'm a Republican who believes in free trade, and I'm an inclusive Republican, not an exclusive Republican. I consider myself to be kind of Abraham Lincoln-ish or Teddy Roosevelt-ish, and I have a hard time with protectionism, and I have a hard time with limiting access to this country for people who want to change their lives and make a difference. Yes, we have a problem that the manufacturing cycle is one that America does not have a competitive advantage. So the woolen mills, the cotton mills, they're gone. They're not going to be here. New Hampshire, Jaffrey had more sheep than all of New England, just in the town of Jaffrey, when the woolen mills were functioning. Doesn't happen that way anymore. But there are jobs. If you go look at the construction trades in particular, they are looking for craftsmen and roofers. There are jobs. I would like us to be more welcoming to those people who are willing to work and come to America and make a difference. And we need it to sustain ourselves because we are not propagating the way we used to. We are not. We would have, take a look at Europe. Europe is starving for people. We will also be in a position where we need more people in this country. It will change the demographics of the country, but it's a reality. I want people to celebrate our democracy. I want them to be part of government. I would like them to come and aspire to be citizens. Have any of you are any of you naturalized citizens? Yes. There is no greater ceremony to witness than a naturalization ceremony. The people who come in, who have done homework, they had to pass a test. I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill. They had to know what that meant, and they had to read the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. They had to be able to pass a test and stand up and take an oath and give up all of their allegiances to the past, pledge allegiance to the United States, promise to answer the call to duty in the country. It's a big deal. We should be celebrating when people become citizens of this country. We like citizens of this country, and we want them to become citizens. That's my view. I know that it may not be mainstream Republican today, but that's my view.
So I think, if you're going to do this and address this issue, you've got to have three components. Number one is you have to put money into educating and moving people when the workforce demands in that region change. Now, this is a real problem because with both members working in a family and with a home and with kids in school, the theory of labor market mobility, it doesn't work very well. And I saw it when I ran for office. And I remember going to Wisconsin and a guy telling me in Wisconsin, I said, I've never been to Racine. What's it like? He said, oh, it used to be a great town, 6 big auto plants. Graduate from high school, get a job, the union takes care of you. If you have an argument, the union moves you to the next plant. And, you start with, you're making $18 an hour, you're in Thursday night bowling leagues. Pretty soon you get married, you're making $40 an hour on average. It was a good life. I said, so what do you do now? He said, well, so I work, 2 jobs. I'm a baggage handler at the airport, and at night, I'm a cashier in a convenience store. He said, but I can't move because my daughter's in the state university. No one's going to buy my house, and my wife has a job. And so this is a real dilemma for modern society. When we went to globalism, we cheated ourselves because the idea was that everyday low prices were going to help the consumer, but that the government was going to help labor market adjustment. And we never put the resources into it. There was a law passed, Andy. It was like the Comprehensive Education and Training Act, right? CETA. And it was, but we weren't good at identifying what the skills were and where the vacancies were. We didn't have the mechanism. We can't do it through the state employment agencies. You have to have a profit motive. You have to have a profit motive to do this. So I know the firms that are in this space now because in my business career, I work with one of those firms. It's called TMP. And what they do is below the corporate headquarters level, they find and bring workers to high-tech firms that need like computer programmers and people who understand artificial intelligence. It's just a matter of that model spreading throughout the economy. And we've got to have a tighter tie-in. Ingalls Shipyard in Virginia, where we make aircraft carriers, is short 7,000 welders. 7,000 welders. So everything's delayed, everything's higher cost. On the Gulf Coast, they're bringing in welders by bus because there's not enough welders in the area. I was with the Navajo Nation about 2 months ago, and they're sending their young people to a welding school in Tulsa, but they can't get enough young people to go. It's a matter of competitive wages. It's a matter of where the government can assist by training. It's a matter of private enterprise stepping up to this. Got to have continuing adult education. And people have to expect to go to different, but then if you're going to expect people to go to adult education for 6 weeks or 6 months to get retrained, you got to pay them a salary. They're not going to do it without a salary. And so who's going to pay that salary? And this has to come from, this is part of the society that supports American corporations. So American corporations have to give up a little bit to pay for that training and education to find and fill the 2.7 million jobs today that are unfilled. 2.7 million jobs are unfilled. But people can't get to those jobs, aren't qualified for those jobs, and don't know how to do it. So labor market mobility has to be funded. Adult education has to be funded, and the private sector ingenuity has to come into here, and we have to, this is a new employment opportunity, connecting positions to unskilled or semi-skilled or professionally skilled people. It only works at the corporate level right now, but it's going to move down because with massive data processing, it's entirely feasible. You'll know every single worker in America, everyone who has a welding skill. You'll communicate with them directly. You'll tell them what the job opportunity is. And the employer, or some combination of employer and government, will say, we'll give you a moving allowance to come here. We'll pay you a salary to be trained in a higher skill level, and we'll move you up. It can be done, but it takes a vision and leadership to get it done. We have to face this in the economy. We can't keep leaving people behind.
Sir, Mr. Mendez.
General, thank you for coming. Mr. Secretary, thank you for coming. My question is, the Renew America theme, which is admirable, but the draw to politics, I'd like both of you to comment on, especially for these students and young people here, the politician, especially the multi-term politician, are all very wealthy men and women. And they seem to become wealthy during their times in office. That is the perception. My question is, term limits, especially general, term limits seems to be an appropriate balance to that, in that state that we have, that the men and women who stay in office too long become so insulated that they are unapproachable and that they are tempted, they are constantly barraged by the lobbyists from every direction, every day. And it is almost impossible to resist that. So given that there is so much corruption that we see, how would you address that? And what would you say to a person who's thinking of running for office regarding that poison that they will most certainly run into? Thank you.
First of all, I disagree with your premise. I don't think there are very many people who are in politics who make money in politics. I mean, the politicians, the office holders get their salary, they disclose everything. I don't think they're making a lot of money. I know I gave up a lot of money to serve as chief of staff to the president. I mean, my salary was dramatically lower than it was in the private sector. So I did not become wealthy by being the chief of staff to the president. The echo of my service did create opportunities I never would have dreamed I would have had. But I had some pretty remarkable dreams that I was living before I became chief of staff. The other thing is, I used to think that term limits might be good until I saw the unintended consequences. And I do agree with the general. I think that, especially in Congress and obviously in the Arkansas legislature, you lost institutional knowledge. And it's good to have some institutional knowledge. I think there should be a dynamic change in a legislature, but I'm not sure that it should be on a clock that guarantees the legislature will be stupid every 6 years. I'd like a third of it to be stupid every year. But I think it should churn. And so I saw dramatic changes when very knowledgeable committee chairmen were kind of time limited out of their opportunity to be chairman in a committee in the House and the Senate. And it would take almost a full cycle to bring the successor up to the level of competence that the previous chairman had. And it was both parties. It had nothing to do with philosophy. It wasn't conservative or liberal or Republican or Democrat. It was really the nuts and bolts of unintended consequences. A long-tenured chairman had more understanding of unintended consequences than a new chairman. And so he wouldn't have as many unintended consequences when he was senior in position, and the new guy would come in and say, there were all those unintended consequences showing up again. So I do think there's a good balance. I actually have more faith in the people. I think I like the people deciding who should represent them rather than the institution deciding who should represent them. And it would end up being institutional if you said everybody's term limited out, or if they have a rule. It's a house rule, how long you can be chairman. That's the institution deciding it. It's not necessarily us, but I believe in the republic, so I'm willing to give people the right to be stupid and as leaders. So have a hard time with that. But the other thing that I challenge you on, this is going to sound strange, and I probably get in trouble for saying this. When you're in a position of responsibility where you have to get a lot of information in a very short period of time quickly to someone who has to make big decisions, like a president, that's what the chief of staff does. I need information. And you get information from people around you, the White House staff. Then you go to the experts at the Defense Department or the National Security Team. You reach out and you get information. And then you want to get information that is not coming from all inside that one silo called government. Who do you go to outside the government with information? When I first served Ronald Reagan, it was, quite frankly, go to some academics. And there'd be kind of a list of academics. You'd say, we're going to call Princeton here, or Columbia there, or Harvard there, or Yale there, or New England College. You could find an expert and bring them in. And then during his tenure, there was a resistance on some in academia to come to the White House. They didn't want to be associated with Ronald Reagan. And so they would say, I'd love to come down, but I don't want any of my colleagues to know that I'm coming. So sneak me in the back door and we'll talk and I'll deny I was there. And then Ronald Reagan got frustrated by it And that ended up being a genesis for the creation of the Heritage Foundation, AEI, and the think tanks in Washington, D.C. So the academic community shifted its focus, and it was more inside think tanks in Washington, D.C. Very corrupting. Very corrupting. And then, so back to me being chief of staff. And this was, remember the issue, was a Defense Department issue on procurement, very big deal procurement, big debates run by OMB with the experts at the Defense Department saying, do this, do this, do this, this is how we want to do it. And the president has to make a decision on the procurement process. And I'm going, I have got so much information that comes from OMB, the Defense Department, and a pad at OMB that would, in the budget process. I said, I've got to talk to someone who knows what's going on. So who do I call? Now, I don't have a directory of who in academia should I call on that. So I say, I'm going to call the lobbyists for I'll call the 2 lobbyists for the big companies that are engaged. And I'm going to say, help me. Who is the best expert I can talk to? I know it may be your bias, but I'd like to talk to an expert. Who can I talk to? And who should I talk to on the other side? And they would tell me. And I could count on it being true, because if it wasn't true, I would never call them again for anything. So I depended on, quote, lobbyists to help me get smarter. And I held them to a higher standard than a politician, because politicians do exaggerate when you talk to them on Capitol Hill. They'll overstate their role, they'll overstate their understanding, they'll overstate their knowledge. You go to a lobbyist and you say, help me, I don't know what I'm talking about and I have to talk about it. Who can I talk to? If they don't help you, you never call them again. So they make sure they try to help you. That's what I found to be very valuable, and I'm so afraid that we as a society are encouraging our government to be stupid all the time by denying them the chance to reach out to people and get expertise. So I'm a contrarian in terms of some of the reforms that say you've got to be stupid. If you're smart, you can't serve in government. And if you serve in government and know, you can never tell anybody else who's back in government when you leave. I want them to help make us all smarter. So that's where I come from. I don't find corruption. I did not find the level of corruption that most people think is there. I just didn't find it. And I found corruption when I was in Massachusetts legislature. It was all from bureaucrats. It wasn't from elected officials. And yes, we found quite a bit of it. But that's another story.
So here, let me add this perspective to it. I appreciate what you're saying very much, Andy. Here's a perspective that I had. So when I became a general officer in the Army, I had to give a financial disclosure statement. And I was not on the procurement side. If I'd been in the procurement side, I would not have been allowed to own stock in any defense company, like a Boeing or a Lockheed, because they would be afraid that would have influenced my decision. So because I was just an ordinary old field general, it didn't matter, but I had to list all of my assets. Now, I was busy 24 hours a day, so there was really not much I could do to play the market in any case. And I didn't have time to go shopping for real estate. And I was assigned overseas, so no one came to me and said, General, you ought to be a partner in our business here, and we'll give you this for such and such. But then I asked myself, I went to see the president of one of the 3 presidents of Bosnia. And he told me to meet him in a bank. So I went in, and he was a young guy, about 40 years old, in Mostar. And there was a bright green BMW 750 parked out front. And I said, well, that's a nice car. He said, that's my car. I said, he said, this is my bank. I said, this is your bank? He said, yeah, I own this bank. I said, well, you don't let this bank do business with the government of Bosnia, do you? You're the president of the country. He says, of course it does business. Why wouldn't it? It's a perfectly good bank. And so I realized that's when I first became aware of conflict. So a friend of mine was a Senate Majority Leader. His wife was a lobbyist. She made over $1 million a year by sleeping with the Senate Majority Leader. Was this corruption? There wasn't any law against it. And so you go from obvious payoffs where somebody's given a bribe to do something to people using inside information. I told a story earlier about my friend who was driving me to the airport in Little Rock. He said, "This is my family's corner." I said, "Your family's corner?" He said, "We bought this land." Okay, but how would he know to buy land in a swamp that was going to be the backdoor entrance to the airport? Because his brother was the mayor. Okay, is that corruption? That's the way it works all the way across America. It's always worked like that. So where do you draw this line? It takes money to make money. It takes information to use that money correctly. And how did Lyndon Johnson retire, was an owner of 2 television stations and a big ranch? You think he saved that money on a Senate salary? No. Somebody said, "Lyndon, you're a good man here. We're going to buy these television stations. We'd love for you to have part of it. You come in with us on this. We like you. You're a good man." And they gave him part ownership and the right to have more. So I share your concern about the culture of corruption. It's everywhere in the world because politics is about power, and power provides access to information and access to business deals and money. But the wisdom of the people that founded this country was to bring those conflicts into the structure of the government. Now you got to have the laws on disclosure and so forth. We've had, in the last 4 or 5 years, we've had people leave government because they were doing insider trading. We got an investigation right now of the Secretary of Transportation because she's favoring one state, which her husband happens to represent in the Senate, over others. These things happen, but we don't have really clear-cut laws on influence. We lecture other countries around the world to get rid of corruption, but I'm always amazed when I talk to the American diplomats about their anti-corruption campaigns, how little they know about the corruption in our own country. You can't travel around this country and read local newspapers without finding elements of corruption. Not only it's been trial and conviction, but also in the margins where people get in. So you're asking a kind of a fundamental question. We're into the discussion of the Emoluments Clause today. President Trump says the Emoluments Clause is a phony in the Constitution. Well, I'm under the Emoluments Clause as a retired general because I get my retired pay. I can't be hired by a foreign government. I can't take money, not even travel expenses, from a foreign government. That's what the military lawyers tell me. That Emoluments Clause is there for a reason. It's there to prevent corruption from outside. But there's a million ways around it. If you are an American citizen, but you own a business in Russia, and Russia says, "Hey, we're going to give you a new contract. Now, we like you a lot, and you'll help us get we need a friendly president in the United States. Here's your contract. You're allowed to contribute to a political action committee. That money, it came through your company. You own it. It doesn't say that you can't contribute money that was earned overseas. You're an American citizen. American companies do that all the time. So at the margins, we've got new situations always evolving. And we have to maintain and set the rules that will preserve and protect this democracy. Your question on a culture of corruption is a good one in my view, and it should be raised to everybody who comes through the state of New Hampshire. If we don't like Joe Biden's son taking a job with a Ukrainian oil company, say so. Put it in writing. Say that children of people in office cannot accept any offer of employment that could in any way have anything to do with their position in office. And if you don't like the senator's wife being a lobbyist, say, if you take a job in the United States government, your wife can't work. But then what if you own a farm? You're supposed to sell the farm? And then you can't be on the agriculture committee? You're the guy who understands agriculture. And then you pass a law and it's good for your farm? You're supposed to say, gee, I won't take the money because, you see, it's a really complex area. You have to ask the questions though. And I think it's a good thing you're asking this question, and I would encourage you. We're in an era of new situations with foreign money influencing politics in this country and questions of corruption. So let's get them up there. Ask them to the candidates. What is Elizabeth Warren going to say? What is Bernie Sanders going to say? How are they going to address corruption? And not just platitudes, but some specifics. You know, Secretary Card and I are up here as old guys. And so you didn't get a 3-point plan out of us. We're telling you sort of the wisdom that we've seen. But these candidates are running. They should be bombarded at every step. What about corruption? What about immigration? How are you going to pay for Medicare for all? What are you going to do about Russian interference in elections? And they need to have answers to those questions.
General, Secretary Card, General Farr, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This has been very exciting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.